In 2017, a science YouTuber with a PhD from Oxford learned from her family WhatsApp group that a water engineer working near her parents' home used dowsing rods to locate the mains water pipe. Here are some dowsing rods that I happen to have. The idea is that you hold the rods loosely in your hands and walk around, and when you are walking over water underground, the rods will swing and typically cross. Sounds a bit far-fetched, doesn't it? So this scientist contacted the water company to find out if they condone the use of this unscientific method. And they said they do. And she contacted other water companies, most of which agreed their engineers might also use dowsing. One of her Twitter followers asked Yorkshire Water if they do it. And not only did they say they do, but they tweeted a meme saying magic, which to me showed a great sense of humour. She says she doesn't know which is worse, Yorkshire Water openly stating that they use divining rods, or using a GIF that says magic when justifying it. So it's fair to say that she regarded water engineers' use of dowsing as outrageous and she wanted them to stop. She says, "I can't state this enough. There is no scientifically rigorous, doubly blind evidence that divining rods work. Or in everyday language, divining rods do not and will not work. Any explanations of water dowsing rely on the supernatural. And I am astonished to find two water companies relying on the supernatural to find underground pipes." She goes on that we shouldn't just laugh this off as a bit silly, because it could mean the difference between an entire town having safe drinking water or not. If they use divining rods to decide that there isn't a pipe underneath, and so it's safe to dig there, they could rupture the mains water supply for thousands of people. Well, she doesn't provide any evidence that that has ever happened. Nevertheless, the story was picked up by other media concerned about these unscientific practices of the water companies. The BBC said scientist finds UK water companies use magic, and the science journalist Philip Ball explained that water divining is bunk, and it has prompted outraged demands from scientists that they desist at once from wasting time and money on medieval witchcraft. He calls the practice deluded and asks, so why do myths continue to trump science? And New Scientist magazine is still worrying about it, with an article in 2023 saying 2 of the UK's water companies are still using dowsing, which it describes as scientifically discredited. Well, this is not real science. A real scientist who was told that an engineer used dowsing to find the water main would say, well, that's interesting. Because look, it's this guy's job. His livelihood depends on it. He wouldn't do it if it didn't work. At least that's a reasonable starting assumption, which ought to stimulate us to look into it. The guy says it works for him 8 times out of 10, to which our scientist quotes studies that have shown it doesn't work. Again, a real scientist wouldn't say that the literature says it cannot be, therefore it isn't. They would say, well, that's interesting because previous studies have shown it doesn't work, and yet you find it works for you. Maybe those studies are wrong. We need to look into this. For a real scientist, it's the very fact that it seems anomalous that gets their antenna going. Maybe there is a scientific discovery to be made here. But in this case, we have a very different reaction. We're told that dowsing is explained by the ideomotor effect, whereby your muscles subconsciously move the rods. And we're told that just because the rods move doesn't mean they are moving in response to water underground. And if it seems that way, it's because of confirmation bias, where we remember the successes and forget the failures. Well, there are some leaps of faith here. Let's suppose that it is down to the ideomotor effect. That doesn't prove people aren't detecting water. maybe muscle twitches are the immediate cause of the rods moving, but maybe that twitching is itself caused by people somehow picking up on the presence of water. Flowing water might generate electricity through friction, and because our nerves operate on electric impulses, they might respond to those electric fields, for example. And how does she know that the water engineer is fooled by confirmation bias? That's just a back projection from her preconceived opinion that dowsing doesn't work. She assumes it doesn't work, and therefore, if the water engineer thinks it does work, it must be confirmation bias. And what about this ideomotor effect? Is there any proof it's real, or is it just a label stuck on what scientists assume must be happening? Well, here's a paper describing a study of the ideomotor effect, which wired people up to sensors and showed that indeed the twitching of their muscles seems to cause the movement. It says it has been accepted for over 150 years that the movements are self-generated, but until now recordings of the small movements that create these oscillations has not been performed. And what's interesting is that this research wasn't done until 2019, 2 years after this blog post. So at the time she said it's all due to the ideomotor effect, it hadn't actually been proven that the ideomotor effect is real. It was just something that had been accepted. Now, to be fair, there had been earlier research showing indirectly that the dowsing effect is almost certainly caused by subconscious movements. And in fact, I myself tend to believe that the ideomotor effect is involved, though it could still be that people are somehow sensing the presence of whatever it is they're looking for. But I'm not really here to defend dowsing. The point I want to make is that when you discover that people who ought to know, like water engineers, are finding that dowsing works, the scientific reaction is to say, that's interesting, let's investigate. But the reaction we actually get from the scientific community is to have dowsing banned, to close the whole thing down with a mind that is already made up and a stunning lack of curiosity. Because the first question I had, and I imagine the first question you had, and that any real scientist would have, is, did it work? Did the engineer find the water main? But neither in the original blog post nor in any of the articles I have seen about this incident are we told the answer. And that pretty much tells you the answer is yes, it did work. He did find the water by dowsing. Because you can be sure that if he was known to have failed, they would have certainly mentioned that fact to underline how dowsing is bunk, does not and will not work, and is scientifically discredited. I suppose I could be wrong, but it says a lot that that basic fact is not even considered in all the writing condemning the practice. It implies that empirical results are not important. It's only what's written in the scientific literature that is important. Now, I've talked about real science, but it might be more neutral to say that there are two visions of science on offer. There is science with a small s, which involves what the shaman of Stonehenge once described to me as curiosity without prejudice, i.e. an open-minded interest in finding out about the world. The shaman of Stonehenge is, or was, a transgender woman who hangs out around the stones in a completely unofficial capacity and chats with visitors. In a later email conversation, she drew my attention to the maxims of Ptah-hotep, written down nearly 4,500 years ago. And one of the things Ptah-hotep said was that you can learn from the ignorant as well as from the wise. In this context, I take that to mean you can learn something from a lowly water engineer just doing his job, as well as from the great and learned experts of the university. So yes, science is about investigation and inquiry, getting to the bottom of things, following up leads, finding discrepancies and contradictions interesting rather than dismissing them and explaining them away, being open to information whatever its source, and above all trusting real experiences more than what is written down in books or academic journals. All that is what I call real science, science with a small s. Then the other vision on offer is what I would call science TM, science with a capital S, official science. This science is like a corpus of approved knowledge. It's what scientists hold to be true. It's what is written down in scientific books and academic papers. Science TM is a bunch of facts and theories. If what you think or what you experience disagrees with the database of Science TM, then so much the worse for you. You are wrong. With the first kind of science, science with a small s, you can't really be in disagreement with it because it doesn't know anything. It doesn't involve any particular set of facts. It's just a way of finding out about the world. It just means suck it and see, ask questions, test, experiment. The early 20th century writer Charles Fort, who collected stories about anomalous phenomena, had a saying that captured this well. He said, "When I hear that something has been explained, I keep on investigating." That is the scientific attitude. You never stop learning, probing, pondering. You don't have a set of facts that you park and regard as the truth that nothing can contradict. But with Science TM, with a capital S, that is what it consists of: answers, facts, scientific truths. And scientists are the custodians of this knowledge. They are the people we go to get things explained. They are the people who will tell us, dowsing? Oh yes, that's the ideomotor effect. Everything is worked out. Science TM will tell you what to believe. Now, it's not just me who's saying this. In the 1950s, the philosopher Friedrich Hayek talked about it in his book, The Counter-Revolution of Science, where he drew a distinction between science, which is about discovering new things, and what he called scientism, which treats science as a corpus of authoritative knowledge that is the preserve of a scientific elite, the guardians of scientific truth, who can pronounce from on high, for example, that dowsing is bunk, and shame those who deviate from scientific orthodoxy as being ignorant and superstitious, preferably having their activities cancelled altogether. Hayek particularly blamed the French political theorist Henri de Saint-Simon for pioneering the scientistic approach with his idea that society should be ruled by a council of 21 rational experts guided by scientific laws. And these experts would supposedly be selected by people leaving votes at the grave of Sir Isaac Newton, the god of science. So there is a link to the whole technocracy movement, which I discussed in a previous video, the Coming Brown Age Part 2, and which is very much about the idea that democracy and free markets are dangerous because people will make the wrong political and economic choices, and societies should instead be managed by unelected specialists who, according to the technocrats, can plan the best and fairest way to use the world's energy and resources. Technocracy is not just a crazy dream. We've actually had it and still have it, for example, in communist countries, where society is managed rationally through 5-year plans and the like, supposedly to be fairer and better. And the increasing presence and visibility of things like the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and the World Health Organization suggests that technocratic ideas are growing in strength in nominally free and democratic societies. And science, in the form of scientism, allegedly impersonal, rational, trustworthy knowledge understood by experts, is what legitimizes technocratic control and activity. The technocrats justify their control over your life with scientists say this and science shows that, and trust the science, follow the science. And this idea that science is like a package of esoteric knowledge that is possessed by a particular elite and gives them their power, was incredibly highlighted in a World Economic Forum meeting about tackling disinformation, i.e. about controlling what people are allowed to say and believe. A United Nations official talking about climate change and the pandemic said,
we own the science.
We own the science. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point I wanted to make is that this distinction between science and science TM or scientism has been recognized by many people. C.S. Lewis is another writer who drew attention to the idea of scientism as a legitimizing belief system in his novel That Hideous Strength, which was published in 1945 before Hayek, and describes a future Britain ruled by a scientific elite whose inner members are nevertheless concerned with sorcery and Satanism. He dealt with the theme in other works, and a recent book, The Restoration of Man, C.S. Lewis and the Continuing Case Against Scientism, goes into his thinking and arguments. And others have taken on board the distinction made by Lewis and Hayek. For example, Thomas Harrington, a critic of the pandemic response, has complained, "They told us ridiculously that science was not a continuous process of trial and error, but a fixed canon of immutable laws." It is interesting that the science blogger who criticised the use of dowsing is described in the BBC article as an evolutionary biologist. The field of evolutionary biology is certainly one where people seem to be protective of what they consider to be trusted knowledge and resist those with different perspectives and ideas. In 2015, a group of scientists who believe the theory of evolution needs a rethink held a conference at the Royal Society, which is Britain's leading scientific institution, of which Isaac Newton was once president. The conference was called New Trends in Evolution, and before it even happened, 23 fellows of the Royal Society wrote a letter trying to get it cancelled. The conference was able to go ahead, but very few traditional evolutionary theorists attended, calling it disgraceful, irritating, strange, and post-truth. They didn't want to go along and debate things. They preferred to give it the silent treatment and hope that as few people as possible would notice it even occurred. Now, who do you think is more confident that they have a strong case with logic and facts on their side? The people who want to have a conference and talk, or the people who hide away and get angry at people questioning their ideas? I'll give you a big clue. It's the people who can't stand their ideas being challenged that are afraid those ideas might not stand up to scrutiny. It's the people who don't want to talk about it that know their ideas might not be as true and final as they have been claiming. The president of the Royal Society was surprised at the way these orthodox evolutionary biologists tried to close down the New Trends in Evolution conference, because he said, there's no harm in discussing things. Well, that's where he was wrong. There is harm in discussing things if your whole career is based on claiming something is true and you know that the evidence is not as strong as you would like. Do you imagine that in Islamic mosques or fundamentalist Christian churches they think there is no harm in discussing things? Maybe Muhammad got a few things wrong. Maybe Jesus wasn't such a great guy. Of course, religious fundamentalists don't think it's okay to discuss things like that, and nor do traditionalist evolutionary biologists. The conference was called New Trends in Evolution, and the 23 scientists who wrote to get it banned showed that they didn't want any new trends. For them, the theory of evolution is just fine as it is. We know how evolution works. You can take it to the bank. As one pro-evolution book says, why evolution is true. There you have it. Scientism. Science as a body of secure knowledge. But the people behind the New Trends in Evolution conference don't believe that evolution is true. They think there is still more to find out. And these are not random crackpots or religious nutters. They are qualified academics at universities like St Andrews, Oxford, Stanford, Australian National, Vienna, Indiana and Tel Aviv. And they're far from alone. A great book by someone who was at the New Trends in Evolution conference is Evolution in Four Dimensions by Eva Jablonka and Marion Lamb. And here are some books from my shelves. Uncommon Descent, Intellectuals Who Find Darwinism Unconvincing. Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. Mystery of Mysteries, Is Evolution a Social Construction? What Darwin Got Wrong. Thinking Beyond Darwin. These are serious books with serious points. And I'm not just someone who collects anti-evolution books. I've got far more books on conventional evolutionary theory. As you can see here, Molecular Evolution of Life, The Evolution of Sex, Development and Evolution, An Introduction to Evolutionary Genetics, The Origin of Species, The Mechanism of Evolution, Evolution and the Fossil Record, and so on. But the point is that there are people who know what they are talking about, who have problems with the theory of evolution. And those are the people who the traditionalists want to stop from coming together in conferences and who they don't want you to hear about. When those people come forward saying, look, this aspect of evolutionary theory doesn't really work and we think a new direction could be better, they don't say, well, that's interesting. What have you found out? Why have you got a problem? What's your solution? They say, that's disgraceful. That's very irritating of you. And that makes evolutionary theory scientism or science TM, a set of supposed truths owned by the cognoscenti that you must not challenge. It's telling that evolutionary theory is still described as Darwinism, like Marxism. It's a doctrine very much associated with its founder. Marx and Darwin were both figures of the 19th century, with sweeping theories of nature in one case and society in the other. And their theories were founded on quite a lot of ignorance, tinged by the prejudices of their day. Darwin knew nothing about genes and DNA, or how the mechanisms of heredity worked. He actually could have known about genes because Gregor Mendel, who discovered them with his work on pea plants, sent his papers to Darwin. But one of Darwin's friends said, oh, Mendel, he's just a crank. Don't waste your time with that. So Darwin never bothered to read them. And Darwin only had a very rudimentary understanding of the fossil record. Similarly, Marx based his ideas on the economics, sociology and anthropology of the early 19th century, when colonialism was in full swing and slavery was still legal in the United States. And his understanding of East Asia or of simple societies in Africa was formed through the lens of European writers who divided the world into superior and inferior peoples. So, as this article says, his theory of history contained racist components. He and Engels racialized skin color groups, ethnicities, nations and social classes, while endowing them with innate superior and inferior character traits, believing that races endowed with superior qualities would boost economic development and productivity, while the less endowed ones would hold humanity back. The article says of Marx and Engels, their numerous horrendous comments on Slavs, Negroes, Bedouins, Jews, Chinese and many others are well known. And Charles Darwin was writing around the same time and drawing on similar material for his book The Descent of Man, where he states, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. I'm not trying to say that Marx and Darwin should be cancelled and we should start tearing down their statues. What I am saying is that they developed their ideas based on both information and cultural assumptions that we now consider to be limited, distorted, ignorant, and false. Of course their theories are simplistic and wrong. Imagine if you were trying to formulate your view of the world based only on books written before about 1850. Your ideas would be hopelessly naive and out of date, wouldn't they? So yes, it's hardly surprising if Marxism and Darwinism are full of holes and don't match what we now know about societies or about biology. But for their adherents, this doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Marx's predictions about the end of capitalism have proven wrong and self-proclaimed attempts to bring about a Marxist utopia have ended in economic failure and political repression. People are still drawn to Marxism and hold it to be true in spite of its failures, saying, for example, that we just need to try real Marxism. And similarly to its adherents, it doesn't matter if there are many things that seem to be unexplained by Darwinism or even contradict it. They still consider it to be true, believing that one day all the gaps will be filled in and the contradictions will be explained away, and Darwinism will emerge supreme. With Marxism and with Darwinism, it's all a matter of faith and belief, independent of any evidence. And why is this? It's because they feel right. To Marxists, it feels right that capitalism is exploitative and will disappear as we move towards a fairer society. Jeff Bezos is rich, we are poor, and we give Jeff Bezos our money when we shop at his store. It feels right that Jeff Bezos must be exploiting us. And with Darwinism, its basic premise is natural selection, the survival of the fittest. And to its adherents, that feels right. It seems like a no-brainer. Giraffes have long necks, and that helps them eat the leaves from trees. Giraffes with short necks would starve to death. Therefore, what must have happened is that giraffes with short necks died out, and that's how we ended up with giraffes with long necks. To Darwinists, at least, that seems like the perfect explanation, especially when we know that farmers can develop sheep with better wool, say, by selecting sheep with good wool and breeding only from them. The farmer's process of selection works, and the genius of Darwin, and also, of course, of Alfred Russel Wallace, who discovered the idea at the same time, was to realise that nature could do a similar job of picking and breeding from the best, because inferior organisms would be less likely to produce offspring. And Darwin's idea perhaps caught on because it was in tune with the thinking of the times. The fact that Wallace came up with it around the same time suggests the idea was in the air. And there were others who had grasped the concept, such as Patrick Matthew and William Charles Wells, who used it to explain the origin of racial skin colours, and both of whom Darwin later acknowledged as having come up with the idea before he did, or at least before he published his book, though they didn't explore its full significance. And in their chapter From Population to Organisation Thinking in Complexity Perspectives in Innovation and Social Change, David Lane and his co-authors describe how in 1859, the same year Darwin published The Origin of Species, the first dog show was held in Victorian Britain. And dog shows not only developed into a popular activity, but led to a proliferation of dog breeding, resulting in the many varieties we know today. So this may have meant that people were becoming aware of the power of selection to change the forms and behaviour of organisms. And belief in selection and the survival of the fittest may also have been encouraged by the experience of colonialism, whereby Europeans seem to have shown themselves more successful than other human groups, allowing their population to grow and spread around the world, where they became the dominant elite. So arguably, when Darwin said the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races, this was not so much a bug as a feature of his thought. And Oswald Spengler pointed out that Darwinism expresses the typical Western worldview that life is about competition and a struggle for power, which is found, for example, in the philosophy of Nietzsche. Or Spengler also refers to Schopenhauer, saying, "There is nothing in Darwin that is not already in Schopenhauer." So Spengler argues that Darwinism is not an objective observation of the facts. It's just the way you would expect a Westerner to look at things. Someone from a Buddhist culture, say, might interpret things differently, emphasizing not the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, but cooperation and coexistence, as in the way that bees pollinate flowers. Nevertheless, in the early 20th century, Darwinism got a boost when mathematicians proved mathematically that if you have a population with two trays, one of which provides a slight survival advantage, the better tray will spread. And they also solved seeming conundrums, such as why creatures help their offspring or even their siblings, showing that it is consistent with natural selection because your sibling has some of your genes and you can help your genes to spread by helping your sibling. On the other hand, some troublemakers raised quibbles, such as how do you explain something like the eye, which has a lot of different parts that would seem to be useless unless they all appear together. And while selection can lead to things like different breeds of dog, this just operates on genetic diversity that's already present in the population. How can you be sure that natural selection can create new species where there seems to be real novelty, like being able to breathe on land or to fly? And if natural selection is about better types of organisms surviving instead of inferior types, how come we still have bacteria and slugs and worms and all these lowly forms of life still happily surviving alongside the superior forms of life that are supposed to have evolved from them? And how did life get started in the first place? And where are the missing links? Where are the intermediate fossils showing one organism turning into another? And the response of the evolutionists was that this is nitpicking. The idea of natural selection is so obvious and so neat that it has to be right. Evolutionary biologists might not have definitive evidence-based answers to those questions yet, but they can make a good guess. For example, the eye might have started as a light-sensitive patch, and then the other bits would have gradually improved its performance. And natural selection fits organisms to evolutionary niches, which doesn't mean the old niches disappear. And maybe there were chemicals floating around in a primordial soup, and some of the chemicals drifted together and helped each other reproduce, and hey presto, you had life. And evolutionary biologists would also draw checks on the bank of the future, as I've seen it described, suggesting that while they haven't got perfect answers right now, they will come up with better answers over time. For example, the lack of missing links is just because people haven't yet discovered them, but they will surely turn up one day. Or now, as the lack of missing links is becoming increasingly glaring after a couple of 100 years of fossil hunting, it's said, well, the transitions were very brief, so you can't really expect to find missing links anyway. That's the argument of Jerry Coyne in Why Evolution is True. We don't need to produce missing links because we have the before form and we have the after form, so we know there must have been missing links even if they don't show up in the fossil record, which sounds rather like a circular argument. So evolutionary biologists have a strong attachment to Darwinist theory, even though there is so much they are ignorant about, such as the missing links and how life got started, and the fact that although scientists have observed natural selection, no one has ever witnessed the origin of a species, despite that being the title of Darwin's book. And I would posit a kind of law here that the less people actually know, the more committed they are to their beliefs. As you start to know more, you also get a better grasp of how much you don't know, and that makes you more cautious, less certain. So certainty can be a sign of ignorance. In his book, How Nature Works, Per Bach says he once asked some cosmologists why their discipline was characterized by almost universal belief in one orthodoxy, i.e. the Big Bang, given how little they really knew about the origins of the universe. And they replied that it was exactly that lack of knowledge that made them committed to their belief system, because otherwise it would be a case of anything goes, and there would be nothing to keep them together as a discipline. And what's perhaps ironic is that Darwin himself made this point, saying ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. I think this may also be what they call the Dunning-Kruger effect. Anyway, with the growth of biological knowledge over recent decades, evolutionary theorists have got a better understanding of what they don't know, as phenomena not imagined by Darwin have come to light, and they have in fact made various concessions, even if they try to convey the impression that all is well, Darwin remains basically correct and nothing has really changed. One important development involves the work of Lynn Margulis, a great scientist who helped James Lovelock with his Gaia hypothesis. Margulis argued that cell organelles such as mitochondria and chloroplasts were once free-living bacteria that invaded other cells and became symbiotic with them. So in every cell of our body we have mitochondria, which help power the cell, and they have their own DNA reproducing under their own steam rather than being generated by the normal DNA that is in the nucleus. Margulis said that this is because they were originally bacteria that got inside the earliest cells a very long time ago, like parasites really, and have become a useful part of the cell. Well, her idea was rejected because it doesn't fit the Darwinian theory of evolution, which is about descent with modification, not invading bacteria. And so she must be wrong because, as Jerry Coyne tells us, evolution is true. Only the evidence built up, and it eventually became clear that Margulis was absolutely right. And you see, Margulis's theory is not about competition and the struggle for existence. It's about symbiosis, i.e. about cooperation and organisms working together for the benefit of both. So that's an aspect of evolution that isn't in Darwinism. But to evolutionary biologists, it can be overlooked as just a quirk, just a one-off, that needn't shake biologists' belief in the basic truth of natural selection. Only it shouldn't really be overlooked because symbiosis is widespread in nature. I've already mentioned bees and pollination. Another example is the root nodules of plants, where bacteria form a symbiotic relationship with the plant, providing it with nitrogen and protecting it from disease. And we have bacteria in our gut that aid digestion. So yes, nature seems to be all about organisms working together to be more than the sum of their parts, not about a struggle for limited resources in which there can only be a few winners and the rest are eliminated. Now, at this point, I should say something about the phrase survival of the fittest, which was actually coined not by Darwin, but by the sociologist Herbert Spencer in summing up Darwin's ideas. In this phrase, fittest does not mean strongest, healthiest, things like that. It's old-fashioned language, meaning the ones that fit the best. So you could argue that Darwinian theory is indeed saying that natural selection selects the organisms that fit in with others. So this kind of cooperation, symbiosis, is perfectly compatible with Darwin's ideas, or even the main point of them. Well, yeah, kind of. You can bring symbiosis into Darwinism in this way, but it's really a different emphasis from the original idea of traits competing against each other for dominance. And the prevalence of cooperation in nature suggests that maybe the Darwinian approach is really looking at things from the wrong end of the telescope. But there are other, even clearer contradictions of Darwinism that have come to light in recent times, showing that natural selection is at best just part of the picture. The book of Jablonka and Lamb is a really good introduction to all this. One of the issues is the phenomenon of plasticity. An example of this is a species of fish called Polypterus, which is happiest underwater, but can also survive in air. And the point is that when individual Polypterus are taken out of water and forced to live on land, their bodies change, with their lungs growing and their bones becoming stronger, allowing them to move about more easily. That is plasticity. So if we look at Polypterus swimming around and consider the shapes of their bodies through the eye of a Darwinist, we'll say, oh, they've evolved to be like that through the power of blind natural selection, which has allowed the Polypterus with the most efficient body shapes to survive. But the phenomenon of plasticity tells us that it isn't really quite like that. The Polypterus can take on different body shapes depending on its circumstances. It has the potential for different shapes. And if it has this particular shape when it's in water, it's because it has adjusted its body, kind of transformer-like, to the needs of swimming in water. That is a form of adaptation to the environment that can affect each individual, and it's not evolutionary or anything to do with natural selection. And in general, the forms and behaviour of many other organisms, perhaps all of them, could result from this kind of individual adjustment and not be explainable by Darwinian evolution. And perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised by plasticity, because arguably our own cells exhibit it. We have liver cells and brain cells and skin cells and blood cells, and they all contain the same DNA, but it gives rise to different cell types when it is exposed to different biochemical environments in the developing embryo. And this leads on to another whole area that does an end run around Darwinism, which is epigenetics. This refers to changes that take place in DNA in an individual's lifetime, involving biochemical structures that build on the DNA, switching some parts off and other parts on. The main book I've read on this is The Epigenetics Revolution by Nessa Carey, and it's epigenetics that causes our cells to differentiate into liver, brain, blood, etc. While they all have the same basic DNA, they have different epigenetic structures built on that DNA. And epigenetic changes can be caused by environmental traumas. Nessa Carey gives the example of children born to mothers who were experiencing famine. Those children remain small and slim even when they are fed properly after birth. A short period of deprivation in the womb causes epigenetic changes that affect people through their whole lives. So that in itself shows that our bodily forms are not just the result of heredity, and therefore not wholly controllable by natural selection. And what's more amazing is that epigenetic changes affecting the individual can be passed on to that individual's children. So not only do malnourished women give birth to small children, but those small children also give birth to small children, even if they're not malnourished, as though it is a hereditary characteristic. Another example is a shellfish that grows a kind of helmet if it is exposed to the secretions of predators. And the shellfish's offspring also grow the helmet, even if they're not so exposed. Well, this is basically Lamarckism, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. According to Lamarckism, a blacksmith with strong arms and an acquired characteristic will have sons with strong arms, even if they're not themselves blacksmiths. Now, Lamarckism has always been held up as a classic example of a discredited theory, one we can laugh at because it was so wrong and so overshadowed by Darwinism. Poor Lamarck has been the attitude. What a fool. Our hero Darwin put him in his place. And indeed, after the discovery of genes and DNA, Lamarck's idea that, for example, giraffes stretch their necks by reaching for higher branches and that made their offspring have long necks seemed impossible and hopelessly naive. But the new field of epigenetics has shown that inheritance of acquired characteristics does occur, perhaps not in the way that Lamarck envisaged, but enough to say that his ideas were not as wrong and Darwin's ideas were not as right as previously thought. Another issue that some think presents a more fundamental problem for the conventional theory of evolution is the sheer improbability of life arising by random chance. Evolution is the theory that if you put a ball of rock somewhere in space and leave it for a few billion years, you will come back to find that the rocky matter has transformed itself into fields of grass with cows grazing on them. For Darwinists, all this came about by blind chance through the power of natural selection. And this is where creationists say, well, maybe, but doesn't it seem more likely that some intelligence made this happen? Could this really be the result of random collisions between bits of rock? Isn't it more likely that it was designed this way, brought into existence by something purposeful? And some scientists have tried to put numbers to this. Just how likely or unlikely is it that a random sifting process can get you from bare rock to fields of cows in a few billion years? In an essay called Giving Up Darwin, David Galanter, a Yale University professor of computer science, calculates it as follows. The building blocks of life are proteins, and proteins are themselves assembled from amino acids. DNA is the blueprint which provides instructions for making those proteins. So a typical protein contains about 150 amino acids, and there are 20 types of amino acid to choose from, which means that there are 20 to the power of 150 potential amino acid sequences, which is roughly 10 to the 195 possibilities. And that's a lot. There's only 10 to the 80 atoms in the universe. Now, to be viable as a protein for use in building living organisms, the amino acid sequence has to be capable of folding up in a stable configuration. And it's been calculated that only 1 in 10 to the 74 amino acid sequences are stable. And even those stable proteins are not necessarily going to perform a useful function like forming fur or making muscle fibers contract. Galanter guesstimates that maybe 1 in 1,000 stable proteins are actually useful. So he gets that of all possible amino acid sequences, only 1 in 10 to the 77 are useful for life. This means that if you're looking for a useful protein, you're going to have to kiss 10 to the 77 frogs before you find one prince. Now, Galanter calculates that there have been 10 to the 40 bacteria in the entire history of life on Earth. And if we suppose that each bacterium underwent a random mutation when it passed on its DNA, which is very generous because most bacteria pass on their genes unchanged, then that means there were 10 to the 40 rolls of the dice, giving us 10 to the 40 over 10 to the 77, or a 1 in 10 to the 37 chance that in the entire history of life, bacteria could have evolved one more useful protein. It's not a 1 in a million chance. It's not a 1 in a billion chance. It's not a 1 in a trillion chance. It's a 1 in 10 to the 37 chance, which is better known as a snowball in hell's chance. It just couldn't happen. There's not enough time in the history of life on Earth for bacteria to have taken even one step forward on the path of evolution. And that's assuming you start with bacteria. But where did those bacteria come from in the first place? That's a whole other set of evolutionary steps, each one of which could not realistically occur. So Darwinism talks about there being random mutations that natural selection goes to work on to build new, higher forms of life. But when you do the maths, as this Yale professor has done, it doesn't add up. The whole thing is just too improbable. And that's from a purely objective, mathematical point of view. So Galenta says he's not sure he's ready to be a creationist, but he certainly can't be a Darwinist. He used to be, but that was until he did the calculations and realised it doesn't work. Now, let's be clear here. We do see natural selection. A famous example is the evolution of the peppered moth, where during the Industrial Revolution, the moths changed from a light colour to a dark colour, which made them harder for birds to see on trees covered with soot from the factories. But this natural selection goes to work on variety that already exists. Previously, dark moths were just rare, and when the trees turned dark, they had a survival advantage, so that allowed their numbers to grow as a proportion of the population. Classic natural selection. But there were no new biochemical molecules, no new proteins, just a shift in their distribution. And this is the crux of the creationist objection to Darwinism. Creationists don't deny that natural selection, like the peppered moth example, occurs. What they say, though, is that you can't extrapolate from this to assume that it can lead to the rise of new species. Darwinists might say, well, given enough time, it would lead to a new species. But the creationists say that is just a leap of faith, and there are no smoking guns to prove it. It's never been observed either in nature or the fossil record. And this Yale professor has done the maths, and he also says it couldn't happen. And creationists would say that Darwinists are disingenuous because first they focus on things like the peppered moth, saying, look, we can prove natural selection, and creationists are just stupid and unscientific because they deny it. When creationists don't deny that kind of natural selection, and then Darwinists ignore the real crux of the argument, which is speciation that has never been observed and doesn't mathematically add up. Or if they are pressed, the Darwinists say, look, you can't expect us to have the missing links because it's something that's very rare. But we know it happened because we have the before and after, and our theory says that's how it occurred. Now, who's really being unscientific here? As far as I can see, it's the Darwinists who don't want to debate the real issue and who insist on the truth of something for which they don't have any conclusive evidence. And you might say, well, come on, creationists say it's God, a bearded man in the sky. That's just crazy. But has it ever occurred to you that the creationists might be right? When the lack of evidence and mathematical calculations have ruled out evolution by random chance as impossible, what have we got left? As Sherlock Holmes said, when you have ruled out the impossible, whatever is left, however improbable, must be the truth. So the creationists are looking at the cows in the field and they're saying, yes, they could have evolved randomly out of bare rock, but look, isn't it more likely that someone put them there? And of course, it's not really about a bearded figure in the sky. That kind of personalization of God is just for Sunday school. It's about a divine principle, some kind of intelligent, conscious force at work in the cosmos. And you could say, well, that doesn't explain anything because where did God, this cosmic divinity, come from? But that problem exists anyway because all our cosmology can do is say either that the universe has always existed or it was created out of nothing, just as creationists can say either God has always existed or God came from nowhere. When it comes to the mysteries of where the universe came from, creationists are saying, well, we don't know either, but what we do argue is that there is nothing random about life on Earth, and it's part of the same cosmic force or process that gives existence to the universe in general. And what they're saying to Darwinists is, sorry, you haven't proven your case. Nice idea, but it doesn't add up. And the touchiness of Darwinists, to the extent that they try to close down a discussion of some of the anomalies with their theory that isn't even anywhere near creationism, suggests that they are operating on blind belief, perhaps even more than the creationists, who can say they are led towards the hypothesis of intelligent design because the alternative of randomness cannot logically be true. Now, this argument about the improbability of life arising by chance is not a new one. Some call it the junkyard tornado, or even Hoyle's fallacy, after the astronomer Fred Hoyle, who pointed out that even the simplest forms of life require around 2,000 enzymes, which are proteins. We've seen that the chance of assembling one protein, let alone 2,000 of them, is in practical terms zero. Hoyle said that the idea that all the ingredients of life could have randomly coagulated in some primordial soup is like thinking that you could get a 747 from a tornado blowing through a junkyard. The point here is that there is a minimum amount of complexity you need for life. Life needs to be self-sustaining and self-reproducing, and that requires a certain number of moving parts, to move around, to detect food, to capture food, to build your own body, to replicate yourself. All of this needs to come together for life. If any part is missing, the organism won't be able to sustain or reproduce itself, and life will die or die out. So Hoyle's issue is you can't just assemble this piecemeal through natural selection, because natural selection only works on things that live and reproduce. And until you've got all the bits together, it's not living or reproducing. So to get started at all, you have to have this minimum assemblage. And there's the problem. It couldn't happen by chance. What we're talking about here at a more fundamental biochemical level is an autocatalytic set. A biological cell takes in food molecules and processes them through chemical reactions to produce the proteins that serve useful functions, such as providing a structure and enabling motion. Now, the rate of a chemical reaction can be affected by a catalyst, and in biology, proteins can catalyze the production of other proteins, in which case they are known as enzymes. So suppose some living cell is in a sea of food molecules, which are of two types, A and B. And suppose that the cell requires two proteins, C and D, to sustain and reproduce itself. And next, suppose that there is a chemical reaction that produces C and D from a combination of A and B, and this reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme E. Well, looks good so far. We need C and D, and we can get them from the food molecules A and B. The only snag is we need a supply of E. So where can we get that from? Well, suppose that there is a second chemical reaction in which B and C combine to produce E and A, and that this reaction is catalyzed by D. Now everything works. The second reaction gives us our supply of E, and the first reaction gives us the C and D that we wanted in the first place. This is an autocatalytic set. Given a supply of food molecules, it is self-sustaining. It involves a set of chemical reactions that collectively produce the very catalysts they need to work. The set catalyzes itself. It is autocatalytic. So A and B are food, C, D and E are the constituents of the living self-sustaining cell, and A is a byproduct or waste. Now, this is a very simple autocatalytic set, and Hoyle's point is that the realistic autocatalytic sets that make up even the simplest life are too complex to have arisen by chance. Yet they couldn't have arisen by Darwinian evolution, because Darwinian evolution involves the assumption that successful organisms reproduce themselves, so causing their genes to spread. And until we have an autocatalytic set, there is no reproduction. The Wikipedia article calls Hoyle's argument a fallacy and assures us that the theory of evolution has been studied and tested extensively by numerous researchers and scientists, and is the most scientifically accurate explanation for the origins of complex life. Yeah, well, that's what's in dispute. Is it scientifically accurate? That's just an assertion, and one that evolutionary biologists really don't like you to talk about. Remember the president of the Royal Society saying there's no harm in discussing things, and 23 eminent scientists begging to disagree. The Wikipedia article tells us that what Hoyle's argument fails to take into account is the vast amount of support that evolution proceeds in many smaller stages, each driven by natural selection. And again, that's where the objectors say that that vast amount of support is actually zero, because natural selection has only been shown to operate on existing diversity and not to generate novelty. So is Hoyle right here? Well, I don't know. I think there possibly is some fallacy in these arguments about the improbability of life. While I do think Darwinism is crude Victorian grand theory like Marxism, and evolutionary biologists haven't begun to give a logically watertight, let alone evidence-based account of the origin of life, there may still be natural processes that can turn rocks into cows, even if we don't yet understand them. In his book, 7 Clues to the Origins of Life, A.G. Cairns-Smith says what people are forgetting about is scaffolding. People like Fred Hoyle or David Galanter might look at this arch and say, look, every stone is needed for the arch to hold together. If you remove one stone, the whole arch will fall. So this arch could never be built. It will fall down before you get anywhere. And the point is that the arch was built with scaffolding, which held it up until it was complete, and then the scaffolding was removed. And that is a clue to the origin of life, which similarly involves interlocking components where everything depends on everything else. There must have been biochemical scaffolding, which has long ago been removed, leaving us this self-sustaining bunch of proteins, which would mean that people like Hoyle and Galanter are making a mistake in assuming that everything must have come together at once. And Cairns-Smith specifically suggests clay, which may have concentrated organic molecules and played a role in reproducing collections of molecules that had catalysts until they built up to the point that they became self-sustaining. Well, could be, though there is a lot of speculation there. Another idea is the so-called RNA world, which is based on the fact that RNA can do a lot of things, not only encoding genetic information to make proteins, but also acting as a catalyst. So RNA might form a one-molecule autocatalytic set. Well, sounds promising, but some people might say you first need to assemble your RNA, and that takes you back to these wild improbabilities. Another approach is explored by the biologist Stuart Kauffman from the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity in his Origins of Order. He is concerned on one level with gene networks, but more abstractly with the topic of self-organization in complex interacting systems like autocatalytic sets. And his argument is about how order arises naturally and inevitably when you have complex interactions. It's a bit like how the Earth is pretty much a perfect sphere, and it's also supposed to have been formed from many small rocks and asteroids that collided and stuck together during the early formation of the solar system from its dust cloud. And we don't say, wow, that's incredible, the rocks just happened to join together in the way to make a perfect sphere, because we know that gravity makes the sphere the lowest energy state. The rocks would have stuck to each other in some random way, and it's gravity that inevitably compacted the whole thing down to give it a spherical shape. Well, Kauffman is saying something similar about biochemistry. There are deep mathematical principles that mean when you put biochemicals together, they will self-organize into living systems. That's the only way to fall. And that's why he entitled his popular book on the subject, At Home in the Universe. We are a natural consequence of the laws of existence. We are at home here. We are, as he says, expected. Now, although I've read At Home in the Universe pretty closely, and also read his book, Investigations, I've only read about the first 100 pages of this book, and that was quite a while ago. It gets pretty technical, and I've never had time to study it in depth, so I haven't got a clear opinion on whether Kaufman succeeds in his aim of showing we are expected. But this is a top-class professor and an interesting approach. And the point is that it is non-Darwinian. Kaufman says, Darwin taught us the order of the biological world evolves as natural selection sifts among random mutations for the rare useful forms. 30 years of research have convinced me that this dominant view is incomplete. Pulling his punches a bit there. Incomplete. Yes, a mild way of saying I don't believe it. So yes, Kaufman's works, Cairn Smith's Scaffolding, possibly the versatility of RNA, these are some things that suggest the improbability argument may be a bit simplistic. So I don't want to make too much of that argument, but I would still say it presents a huge challenge to the idea that life on Earth is the result of purely natural processes, and even the caveats I have mentioned still leave a lot of work to be done. Nevertheless, the Wikipedia article warns us that the improbability argument is a mainstay of pseudosciences like creationism and intelligent design, and it assures us that Richard Dawkins described it as a fallacy. Now, I should say I have some sympathy and admiration for Richard Dawkins, who can show great patience when debating with biblical literalists whose views are so alien to his own. But I've also long thought that if Richard Dawkins, the champion of Darwinism, had lived in the Middle Ages, he would have been a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, assuring us that the ideas of Copernicus or what have you were fallacy. The style of thinking is the same. It's about aligning oneself with the great orthodoxy of the day, whether Catholicism or Darwinism, and promoting it unwaveringly while lambasting all dissenters. You see, in his book Techniques of Persuasion, the psychologist J.A.C. Brown talks about how people's styles of thought are highly ingrained, even though the content of their thought can change dramatically. He gives the example of the Apostle Paul, who in his earlier life as Saul was a fanatical persecutor of Christians, and after his conversion on the road to Damascus, he became a fanatical preacher of the Christian message. The content of Paul's thought changed 180 degrees, but the style of his thought didn't really change at all. He went from anti-Christian fanaticism to pro-Christian fanaticism, but his fundamental character trait of fanaticism stayed the same. And I think it's the same with Richard Dawkins and his followers. In centuries gone by, he would have been bashing the non-believers, and today he is bashing the non-believers. His style would be the same because that's his personality, and it's just the content that's different, just which orthodoxy he chooses to defend. He was involved with the atheist bus campaign with its message of "there is probably no God." Well, why does he care so much what people believe about God? It's as though he can't rest while there are people out there still believing in God, just like St. Paul couldn't rest while there were still people out there not believing in God. And Dawkins has said that people who claim not to believe in evolution are ignorant, stupid, or insane, or possibly wicked, though he chooses not to go there. Well, I expect there are Christian preachers who will tell you that you are ignorant, stupid, or insane, and possibly wicked if you don't believe in Jesus, because after all, we've got not one but 4 gospel writers who attest to his life. And Dawkins's claims about evidence are just as dubious as the Christian preachers. You see, as we've seen, while the evidence for natural selection in something like the peppered moth is strong, and indeed any sane person would recognize that, the evidence for speciation through natural selection, which is what Darwinism is really about, is circumstantial at best. And for the origin of life through evolution, there isn't even a convincing agreed upon theory, let alone evidence. And notice how Dawkins frames it in terms of belief. Belief is not a scientific concept, it is a scientistic or religious concept. For Dawkins, evolution, like the Christian gospel, is sacred knowledge that you either believe in or you don't. And if you don't believe, woe betide you, because you are wrong. But there are people like Stuart Kauffman and those calling for new trends in evolution who find evolution incomplete. What about them? Are we to consider them believers or non-believers? Well, it's neither really, isn't it? They think it may have some good points, but they also think it's not the final answer. We can't logically call them believers, but they have biology PhDs and university positions. They're certainly not ignorant or stupid. So does Dawkins really want to claim that they're insane? So this statement of Dawkins is a statement of a medieval cardinal. That's the style of it. It's condemning the heretics and pushing a belief system for which the strong evidence is largely only the assumptions and leaps of faith of the belief system itself. Now, I have a book here by a creationist that I picked up in a charity shop a few months ago. Oh dear, get thee behind me. It's by Jonathan Sarfati, best-selling author of Refuting Evolution. So that would blow Dawkins's gasket. And look at this cover. Science stands tall, while evolution, the white chess piece, has been knocked over and lost the game. So the message is that the crude Victorian belief system known as Darwinism is defeated by science, true science, the science of free, unbiased inquiry, which you might consider strange coming from a creationist work if you have been conditioned to think of creationism as the opposite of science. But we learn the author has a PhD in physical chemistry from the University of Wellington, New Zealand's capital city. He's also represented New Zealand in 3 chess Olympiads. And he is a creationist. He works for Creation Ministries International, and this book is published by Creation Book Publishers. So yeah, this should be ground zero for creationist craziness, and as Wikipedia tells us, pseudoscience. The book's title is The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Refuting Dawkins on Evolution, and is a response to The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution by Richard Dawkins. Now, if you look through this book, it seems to argue on the facts. It doesn't simply assert something like God exists and any sane, educated person has got to believe in creationism. For example, it deals here with what Dawkins says about fish which live in dark caves and have lost their eyesight, and how not only have their eyes deteriorated, but they have grown skin over them. Now, Dawkins seems to realise that fish losing their eyesight is not good evidence for Darwinism, because it just involves losing something that was there before. Remember, the problem is that of creating novelty through natural selection, such as in David Galanter's calculation that there is only a 1 in 10 to the 77 chance of coming up with a useful protein by random chance. We don't need to believe that calculation exactly, but it highlights that this is the crux of the problem. It's Darwinism's weak point. Everyone, including creationists, accept that evolution can be destructive, such as losing the ability to see. But can it be creative? That's what we want to know. Can it get from bacteria to cows? So it seems Dawkins realises this, and that's why he mentions the skin growing over the eyes. That's the creative aspect. And this is what Sarfati attacks. For a start, he mentions the issue of pleiotropy, where a single gene has more than one effect on an organism. It turns out that a control gene, hedgehog, which affects a number of processes including development of the jaws and taste buds, also inhibits another control gene, PAX6, which controls development of the eyes. A fish with bigger jaws and more sensitive taste buds would have an advantage in finding food, but this must be traded off with the loss of eye development. In the light, loss of eyes is a big disadvantage, so natural selection would eliminate a fish that overexpresses hedgehog, despite its better jaws and taste. But in the dark caves, a fish with highly expressed hedgehog would have a big advantage, since the loss of eyes would be irrelevant. And for this he references a paper in the Journal of Heredity. He's not refuting Dawkins here, he's just filling in detail, explaining some subtleties of why cave fish lose their sight. It's not just because they don't need it, it's because there is this trade-off resulting from gene networks. So it's really just a shift in the balance of that trade-off, like in peppered moths, with the shift from whether it's better to be a dark moth or a light moth. In this case, whether it's better to have small jaws and working eyes, or big jaws and non-working eyes. But having given this extra background detail, Sarfati goes on, unless Dawkins can show that the growth of skin over the eye sockets involves the creation of new genes by natural processes, it does not qualify as proving evolution. Sarfati suggests other explanations, such as a pre-programmed response to having an unfilled hole in the skeleton of the fish, or another pleiotropic effect if the genes for normal eyes prevent skin from growing over the eyes, and when those genes are damaged, skin growth becomes possible. Now, it's not that Sarfati is right, it's that Sarfati has pointed out that Dawkins has not provided evidence for his claim that the growth of skin shows creative evolution, and there could be other explanations. So that is an example of creationist pseudoscience. It looks to me very much like actual science. Dawkins has presented his argument, and Sarfati has pointed out flaws in that argument, using logic and facts backed up by citations from the scientific literature. And the proper scientific thing to do is not to say, unless you believe in evolution, you are stupid, insane, and ignorant. It is to say, well, that's interesting, Sarfati. You could be right. That could be the explanation. We need to look into this. Let's see if we can eliminate those possibilities by further investigation and thereby improve the case for evolution. Now, I chose this page pretty much at random, and the whole of the book is like this, taking Dawkins's assertions, pointing out the gaps and flaws, and presenting an alternative view. Now, there could be some cherry picking. Perhaps Sarfati picks on the weaker parts of Dawkins's argument and fights the battles he knows he can win. But even so, he performs a useful scientific function, because science should be about checking and rechecking the quality of its arguments. And if evolutionists can answer his criticisms and improve their arguments, that is as it should be. And one aspect that really struck me was where he deals with Dawkins's chapter about evolution's bloopers and fails. Dawkins talks about various aspects of nature that don't seem very sensible, and his argument is that there cannot be an intelligent designer, God, because God surely wouldn't have designed things this way. Now remember, this is a book in which Dawkins is laying out the evidence for Darwinian evolution. He says at the beginning that in all his other books he's kind of assumed Darwinism is true because it's so obvious, and in this book he's finally going to show the proof. So he's putting his best case, and he spends time saying, oh, look at this illogical aspect of nature. If there was a God, he would never have come up with such a crap design. Therefore, there can't be a God. Therefore, Darwinian evolution must be true. This is a weak argument, which makes assumptions about how God would behave and relies on a false dichotomy that either it was God or it was Darwinian evolution, when we've seen that people like Stuart Kauffman can have problems with Darwinism without saying it was God. The fact that Dawkins attacks creationists to advance the case for Darwinism kind of hints that he is short of better material. Anyway, the thing that struck me was where Sarfati talks about Dawkins's argument regarding the vertebrate eye. The cells of the retina pick up light and feed it back to the brain via nerve fibres. And what seems crazy is that you would think the nerve cells would be attached to the backs of the retina cells, but in fact they're attached to the front of the retina cells. So you have all these trailing wires all over the front of the retina, getting in the way of the light that is trying to get to the retina. And not only that, but the wires then have to be brought back through the retina to form the optic nerve leading to the brain. So we have a blind spot where there's a hole where the wires go through the retina. And Dawkins says any sensible person would have put the wires at the back. If this is what God came up with, he must be stupid. And Dawkins points to the octopus eye, which does have the nerve cells at the back, to show that God could have done it that way if he had wanted to. So yeah, the vertebrate eye looks like a stupid move. Well, God is perfect, so he can't be stupid, so this cannot have been designed by God. Therefore, it must have come about by natural selection operating on random mutations. And I've heard this argument before. You probably have too. And I found it to be convincing, and I've always thought it's a good point against the idea of intelligent design. But you see, I was brainwashed. I only ever heard the Darwinist side of the argument. When people discussed new trends in evolution, the Darwinists called it disgraceful and tried to shut it down. I was told that creationism is pseudoscience, and I was told that if I didn't believe in Darwinism, I must be insane. But I broke through the programming and bought this book. And what Sarfati says is that there is a very good reason why the nerve cells attach at the front. It's because the back of the retina is packed with blood vessels which supply the light cells with energy and take away heat. And that is absolutely necessary because the light cells are regenerating themselves many times a second, which requires a lot of energy and oxygen. So there's no room at the back of the retina for nerve fibres. You couldn't put the blood vessels in front because they are opaque, whereas the nerve cells are nearly transparent. And in any case, there are structures called Mueller cells that are like optical fibres carrying light through the nerves to the retina. So this design is actually quite sensible and well thought out. And Sarfati notes how Dawkins tries to exaggerate the problem by saying the blind spot is more like a blind patch. But Sarfati points out the blind spot is only 0.25% of the visual field, and it's off-centre, so it doesn't block our most important vision. And it's so little of a handicap that it doesn't stop a one-eyed person from being allowed to drive. So yeah, the blind spot is not really an issue. And Dawkins also makes much of the fact that most of our vision is quite coarse and we have just a small area, the fovea, with the really detailed vision. Dawkins says if God was designing it, surely he'd have given us detailed vision all over. But Sarfati points out that this would inundate our brains with detail, all of which would have to be processed, requiring a much bigger visual cortex. It's more efficient that our peripheral vision can detect key features and then we can swing our eyes to inspect the detail if we want. This is an optimal way of trading off area of coverage and amount of detail. And it would really be disadvantageous to have detail all over the retina, as it would make reading, for example, very distracting with all the words on the page equally in focus. And as for the octopus eye as a supposedly more efficient design that God could have chosen, Sarfati points out that the octopus eye is inferior to the vertebrate eye, with no colour vision, for example. And there's a good reason why we say eyes like a hawk and not eyes like an octopus. So, yeah, Sarfati shows what Dawkins says about the eye is biased and missing key facts. And when you have the full picture, you can see that the eye is not badly designed at all. It is excellently designed. One of the researchers who discovered the Mueller cells said, "Nature is so clever." And Sarfati says all this has been known for years and there's no excuse for Dawkins not to know it. So it looks as though Dawkins is pulling the wool over our eyes with his frankly false argument that the eye could not have been intelligently designed. And even if Dawkins were right that the eye is badly designed, which it seems he isn't, but even if he were, that doesn't prove evolution. As Sarfati says, if you want to prove that the eye is the result of evolution, slagging off God is not going to advance your case. Show us the actual evolutionary steps by which the eye is supposed to have evolved, which the Darwinists can't do, of course. It's all a leap of faith that the principle of natural selection is so compelling it must have happened that way. So who's the real scientist here? From Dawkins we get misdirection, omission, bluster, and no actual evidence for what he claims to have happened, whereas from Sarfati we get logic and facts and a complete picture. Now, I'm not trying to promote creationism here. The scientific thing is to take Dawkins's arguments and Sarfati's counter-arguments and keep on investigating. And one of the things that makes it hard for me to go far with Sarfati is that he's a young earth creationist. He believes that the earth and all the life on it was brought into existence 6,000 years ago in the 6 days of creation. Now, I don't really buy that, but who knows, maybe it's another way in which I've been brainwashed. We need to keep an open mind. I have this book, Prehistory and Earth Models by Melvin A. Cook. He argues that even if the Earth is billions of years old, all but the last few thousand years of scientifically readable prehistory has been erased, perhaps by world-shaping catastrophes, and he regards the current configuration of the continents as arising from a recent and sudden shift, with the emergence of life similarly occurring only during this recent period of a few thousand years. Now, when you read that, of course, you think, well, that's just stupid. What about fossils and geology? And after all, what kind of forces would it take to move whole continents around all of a sudden? It just doesn't make sense. But when you read this book, you find it's full of facts and evidence and calculations and logical reasoning. It doesn't appear to be the work of a lunatic. And then there's this book, The Path of the Pole by Charles Hapgood, the definitive work on Earth crust displacement and its consequences. And we read on the back, polar wandering, the idea that the outer crust of the Earth moves about. Geologists accept these movements, but put the last change a very long time ago. Hapgood believes polar wandering is primary. The last shift of the Earth's crust took place in recent time at the close of the last ice age, resulting in major climatic changes. And if you look through the book, you see he marshals various evidence to back up his claim. And the thing about this book is who wrote the foreword? Albert Einstein. And what Einstein has to say is, I think that this rather astonishing, even fascinating idea deserves the serious attention of anyone who concerns himself with the theory of the Earth's development. There speaks a true scientist. He didn't say, this contradicts all known geology. He said, that's interesting. We need to look into this. Of course, Wikipedia will tell you that the idea is pseudoscience, and the Rational Wiki implies that Einstein got confused and was duped by Hapgood, and a commenter on a physics forum calls it geoquackery, suggesting that Einstein's letters to Hapgood are forgeries. They're not, by the way, they're completely genuine. But Einstein was a real scientist who believed in investigation, not in sacred knowledge. And he'd made his own contribution to geology with a theory of river flow. So, yeah, I don't personally buy this theory, and perhaps Einstein wouldn't if he were around today. But when a creationist suggests that the present Earth arose from a cataclysm a few thousand years ago, it may not be so stupid and unscientific as it seems. Einstein didn't think so. Now, I've gone down quite a rabbit hole with evolutionary biology, but it was to explore properly how it has become a massive dogma, dismissing its critics as disgraceful and pseudoscientific, when in fact there are genuine holes in it, and arguably one huge hole in terms of its inability to prove the central tenet that species originate from natural selection. And other big areas of science are the same, massive dogmas with big holes at their centre, where dissenting voices tend to get ignored or suppressed. The physicist Sabine Hossenfelter has produced many engaging videos on this with respect to particle physics and quantum physics, such as this one, What's Going Wrong in Particle Physics, brackets, This is Why I Lost Faith in Science. So the kind of analysis I've done for evolutionary biology could be done for other parts of science TM, i.e. the orthodoxy that is taught in schools and university. Now, although science or scientism is a massive dogmatic orthodoxy, real science has not disappeared. As an example, I'll talk about the M drive. This is an idea for a rocket motor developed by Roger Scheuer, an electrical engineer. Now, I'm not advocating for the M drive. It does look from experience as though it doesn't work. But the point is how it was treated. So the M drive is supposed to be a propellantless motor. A normal rocket works by chucking hot gases out the back, and the rocket moves in the opposite direction. It's a consequence of Newton's law of action and reaction, or alternatively, the conservation of momentum, like the recoil of a gun. If you shoot something that way, you will recoil that way. And so the problem with a rocket is you need fuel to chuck out the back. And when the fuel is gone, that's it. Well, the M drive doesn't chuck anything out. It's supposed to do something clever with microwaves. So long as you can get a supply of energy from solar panels, it can keep working forever. Great idea. Except that it contradicts the conservation of momentum. It should not be possible to go that way without sending something that way. The M drive shouldn't work. Well, Scheuer claimed it did work. He had detected some kind of thrust, and he got a grant to help develop it. And in 2006, his idea was featured in New Scientist magazine as an exciting new possibility. Well, when they saw the article, some people who considered themselves the guardians of science and the enemies of pseudoscience swung into action, organising an email campaign to complain to New Scientist, which subsequently apologised for not being more critical of the concept. The complainers' point was that the M drive breaks a well-known law of physics and couldn't possibly work. This was an example of scientistic sacred knowledge. We don't care about Scheuer's empirical findings. It contradicts what is known in the holy book of physics, and therefore it shouldn't be spoken of. Seemingly no different from a Christian fundamentalist only believing whatever is written in the Bible. But the M drive might work by transferring momentum to the Earth's magnetic field or to the quantum vacuum, or something we don't really understand or haven't discovered yet. Or maybe the conservation of momentum really can be broken under some circumstances. Unless we investigate, we'll never know. Even something as holy as the conservation of momentum should be tested from time to time. This was like the attempt to cancel the New Trends in Evolution conference. But while this shows scientism in action, the real message of the M drive is an optimistic one about the state of science, because the M Drive has been funded or investigated by the British government, by universities in China and Europe, by NASA, and by the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The end result seems to be that it's a dud, but still all these agencies took the scientific attitude. Looks interesting, let's investigate. So real science continues and seems quite healthy despite the dominance of science TM or scientistic orthodoxy. Now, there is a tendency to contrast science and religion. Religion is faith-based while science is about free inquiry. And because I'm talking about scientistic orthodoxy as being faith-based and dogmatic, it may seem that I'm going to argue that scientism is a religion. But in fact, I don't think that's the best way to look at it. Instead, I'm going to argue that we need to see both what I'm calling real science and scientism, both of them together, as forming a religion. So in the book Jesus and the Lost Goddess, Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy describe how the early Christians had an experimental, exploratory approach to their religion. There was a proliferation of ideas and interpretations of the Christian message. This is called gnosis, the Greek word for knowing. People were seeking knowledge about the cosmos, its origin and nature, and humanity's place in it. And the new ideas of Christianity seemed to provide a key for unlocking the answers to those mysteries. So today in the New Testament we have just 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But in early Christianity there were many other Gospels which can be very weird and unorthodox from today's perspective. Some of these Gnostic Gospels are gathered in this book, the Nag Hammadi Library, which is named after a town in Egypt where they were discovered in 1945. So we have On the Origin of the World, the Book of Thomas the Contender, who is supposed to have been Jesus' brother, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Thought of Noria, the Interpretation of Knowledge, the Gospel of Mary, and many more. And there are also Gnostic texts not included here, such as the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. So yes, there are all these weird and wonderful texts. They represent very different approaches. Some treating Jesus as just an ordinary human teacher, others treating him as a mythical figure like an Egyptian god, and still others not mentioning him at all. So this period of gnosis in the early church was very much a time of open-minded, free inquiry aimed at uncovering the secrets of the universe and existence. And what happened is that some people didn't like this free-for-all, and they started to have councils to decide which books were acceptable, leading to the modern Bible. And these councils determined what Christians ought to believe, giving us the Creed, which says, for example, that Jesus was both human and divine. And as Christianity became increasingly mainstream with its adoption as the official religion of the Roman Empire, it also became increasingly organised and hierarchical and bureaucratic. So you had this unshakable dogma and this massive institution, the church, to administer it. And Freke and Gandy call this literalism. Gnosis was about, let's find out about the cosmos. Literalism was about, this is the answer, and make sure you believe it. The theologian Elaine Pagels gives an example that draws attention to the different emphasis between gnosis and literalism. In one of the Gnostic Gospels, the disciples, knowing that Jesus is destined to leave them, ask, how will we know the way when you are gone? And Jesus replies, you must bring out what is in you. But in the New Testament, when the disciples ask the same question, Jesus answers, I am the way, no one comes to the Father but by me. In the Gnostic case, Jesus emphasizes the disciples' need to think for themselves, bring out what is in you. In the literalist case, Jesus says, I am the way, i.e. just believe what I tell you. So you went from Christianity as a vehicle for free thought to Christianity as a system of thought control, or from a practice of open inquiry to a fixed package of sacred knowledge. And a friend of mine has suggested that rather than Gnostic and literal, we might call these different modes of Christianity personal and institutional, or we could say open-minded and fundamentalist. But I will stick with Freke and Gandhi's original terms, gnosis and literalism. And Freke and Gandhi argue that this distinction between gnosis and literalism is found in other religions. There have been mystical, inquiring forms of Islam, as well as the Quran bashing type. And Buddhism is associated with spiritual inquiry, but there are also doctrines and organised institutional forms of Buddhism. So Freke and Gandhi say that the big distinction is not between Christianity and Islam, or Christianity and Buddhism, but between gnosis and literalism. Literalist Christians and literalist Muslims have more in common with each other than they do with Gnostic members of their own faiths. The literalists are united by their love of dogma, even if it is different dogma. And they are both different from a Gnostic who is just someone making their own inquiries and developing their personal interpretation. So we need to distinguish the style and the content of belief. Christianity, Islam and Buddhism all have different content, but within each of them there are the same two styles of gnosis and literalism. And the point is that science is the same. It has a different kind of content, but it includes the same two styles of gnosis and literalism. The Gnostics are what I have called the real scientists, the inquirers, the investigators, who are interested in open-ended discovery. And the literalists are the dogmatic, institutionalist adherents of Scientism, who tell us that dowsing is bunk and evolution is true, and who have made science a bureaucratic, hierarchical system of thought control centred upon the universities. Now you might say, wait a minute, a religion like Christianity is based on myths and unprovable supernatural ideas, whereas science is based on practical experimentation with the real world. The idea of heaven is mumbo-jumbo, but gravity is real, and the theories about it are precise and tangible, allowing us to land on the moon, for example. Well, yes, but experimentation has always been part of the Gnostics' toolkit. Some ancient Greeks did experiments, for example, like Eratosthenes, who measured the circumference of the Earth, whereas Einstein, whose face is the very icon of a scientist, never did an experiment in his life. It was all thought experiments. What we are really talking about is gnosis, the desire to understand the workings of the universe, and that can proceed with practical experiments or through pure thought. Whether it's scientific gnosis or Christian gnosis, it has the same aims and arguably arrives at similar places. Hildegard of Bingen was a Christian abbess of the 12th century who was also a composer and a spiritual writer, and she wrote, "Everything that is in the heavens, on earth and under the earth is penetrated with connectedness, penetrated with relatedness." And today quantum physicists talk about quantum entanglement, whereby particles that have interacted remain connected, even if they are separated by immense distances. And insofar as all particles in the universe since the beginning of time have been interacting with other particles that have interacted with other particles, there is a massive chain of connectedness relating us here on Earth to what's happening on other stars and galaxies across the universe. So Hildegard was right. Hildegard of Bingen and quantum physicists have arrived at the same place just by different methods, whether clear thinking and observation or deliberate experimentation, and both in a spirit of gnosis, i.e. open-minded investigation. And it's striking that Hildegard explicitly called for the intellectual freedom of gnosis compared to the dogma and thought control of literalism, saying, "We cannot live in a world that is not our own. in a world that is interpreted for us by others. So you see, the early Christians believed they had discovered a new system or a new way of looking at the world that was better and more accurate than the confused, foolish, naive and illusory ideas of paganism. And similarly, scientists believe they have discovered a new system and a new way of looking at the world that is better and more accurate than the confused, naive and illusory ideas of earlier religions. But just as the Christian church started with gnosis only to be invaded and taken over by dogmatic literalists, so modern science started with gnosis in the early modern era and has come to be invaded and taken over by the literalists. Isaac Newton was described by the economist John Maynard Keynes as not the first of the age of reason, but the last of the magicians. In other words, he was a Gnostic, a spiritual thinker, an inquirer into the mysteries of existence. Newton was interested in understanding God's universe, and he spent as much time working out the dimensions of Solomon's temple as he did on the theory of gravity. To him, they were both potential ways to get at the great cosmic secrets. In their book, The Forbidden Universe, The Occult Origins of Science and the Search for the Mind of God, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince describe how the early scientists of Newton's day were inspired by the Hermetica, a set of mystical texts from the early centuries AD that overlap intellectually with the Gnostic Gospels. And the modern myth is that that was a kind of aberration, a blind alley, irrelevant to the early scientists' real work. But Picknett and Prince show that this is completely false, and the early scientists drew heavily on the inspiration of the Hermetica and could not have succeeded without it. And they show that science increasingly embodies and is energized by those mystical ideas, with its concepts of the relativity of time and space and the mysterious connectedness of quantum entanglement and the fact that things aren't completely real until we consciously observe them, like Schrödinger's cat, which is in a combination of possibilities until someone opens the box. Science is coming full circle to the speculations of the Hermetica that guided the scientific pioneers. And Picknett and Prince point out that the church had a problem with the early scientists, not because they were not Christians, but because they were Gnostics. You see, the church was, of course, a literalist organisation, and as Freak and Gandhi argue, the really important distinction is not between different religions, but it's across the literalist Gnostic divide. The church didn't always have a problem with such ideas as that the earth goes round the sun. What it couldn't stand was people thinking for themselves and delving into texts like the Hermetica that had long ago been suppressed in favour of the particular doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. So science began as a Gnostic personal inquiry, and for a long time it remained an amateur and independent activity. In the 18th century it was seen as a suitable pursuit for ladies, as described by Patricia Phillips in The Scientific Lady. And meanwhile in the universities men studied these serious subjects like Greek and Latin, and women made fundamental contributions like Émilie du Châtelet, who basically originated the idea of energy, and the fossil collector Mary Anning, who was a founder of paleontology. But increasingly universities began to set up science departments, and science became institutionalized as the domain of people in white coats, a new kind of priesthood, leading to that ubiquitous modern phrase, "Scientists say, the priests have spoken." And the early scientists used to circulate letters among themselves, describing and discussing their ideas. And this evolved into the scientific journal and the concept of peer review, whereby scientists established themselves as gatekeepers, controlling the flow of ideas and keeping it within acceptable bounds. Of course, new ideas do get through, but the more original they are, the harder it is. Arguably, Einstein's theory of relativity only had the impact it did because it was very much in line with thoughts that other people were having at the time, so not as original as we tend to think. In the Nemesis affair, the paleontologist David Rapp from the University of Chicago describes his involvement in a controversy surrounding the extinction of the dinosaurs, and he gives a kind of mea culpa about how he and others colluded to suppress dissenting viewpoints. And on page 194, he talks about some of the arguments people give to say why science is supposedly different from religion. And based on his experience, he says, I think these statements contain a fair amount of bunk. In other words, he's not convinced that science is fundamentally different from religion. So, yes, science and Christianity have trodden very similar paths. Christianity began with gnosis as an exciting new source of illumination against the darkness of paganism, and it then became infested with and taken over by literalism as the dogmatists, the people who can't rest so long as there are others out there with wrong thoughts, gained power. And science began with gnosis as an exciting new source of illumination against the darkness of literalist Christianity, and it then became taken over by literalism in its turn. So we could say there is an oscillation in the history of humanity's inquiries into nature and meaning. Gnosis begins in reaction to the prevailing literalism with its established beliefs, and for a while the new movement enjoys a period of intellectual freedom during which fundamental ideas flourish. But then it is invaded by the literalists, who bring people's thought patterns back under control and restore uniformity and conformity. And this has happened to science as it has happened to other religions. And to be fair, while literalism comes to dominate, there is always gnosis going on in the background, as the history of Christianity, for example, is marked by all sorts of heresies, including most fundamentally the Protestant Reformation. And as in today's science, things like the M drive can still get attention and consideration. Now let's go back to this question of whether science is somehow different from other religions, given that it is based on realistic information about the world and its truth is shown by the way it gives us practical things like mobile phones and penicillin. Well, I do believe that humans are making progress in their understanding of the cosmos, and we could say that each phase of gnosis gets us further along in that understanding. So the Gnostic phase of science, the most recent oscillation, has indeed brought us major new insights into what this thing, the universe, is and what we are doing here. The earliest humans believed that the stars are the souls of dead ancestors, and we believe that they are balls of flaming gas. We both have our theories, but yes, ours has more detailed evidence and might be considered more correct. But with respect to science's practical efficacy, i.e. the idea that science is true because it produces things like the computer, we mustn't confuse technology with science. The evolution of technology is a very long-standing phenomenon that goes back to flint tools in the Stone Age. This is not the same as our scholarly understanding of nature, with things like the theory of evolution and the theory of relativity. Yes, scientists can learn from technology, and technologists can use science in their work. For example, thermodynamics was driven forward by work on steam engines, and semiconductor theory is used for making electronics. So there is a large overlap between science and technology. But what I'm talking about here is about our interpretation and deep understanding of the cosmos. This is something that religion typically provides, i.e. answers to where the world comes from and what it consists of. Now, some would say science may address the same questions, but it is different from religion because it practices the scientific method, meaning checking its theories with experiments. But as I've said, this kind of empiricism might be regarded as a tool of gnosis in general, not a prerogative of science per se. It's just that science has fetishized empiricism as its special characteristic. But of course, there are large parts of science that can't really do experiments, like cosmology, geology, and evolutionary biology. They can look at the way the world is and check whether it fits their theory, but they can't rerun time. And the problem I showed with respect to dowsing, Darwinism, or the M drive is that in the dominant sphere of literalist science, empirical methods are only welcome within strict limits. Checking results and assumptions is only welcome if it fits in with the existing paradigm and reinforces it. Don't investigate dowsing, don't investigate alternatives to natural selection, don't investigate the M drive. You shouldn't be using the scientific method in those cases, because the literalists don't want you to check fundamental assumptions like that, testing things like the conservation of momentum. That is, according to them, pseudoscience and shouldn't be done. So empiricism is a kind of totem for these people. It doesn't mean they employ it in practice. It's a badge they wear. But for them, in reality, science is this body of sacred knowledge, not a process of experimental inquiry. And now let's think about how accurate or true is science really. Can we say it's better than religion because its beliefs are somehow more correct? Well, I follow a website called Retraction Watch, which tracks retractions of scientific papers and other problematic aspects of contemporary science. And there are a lot. We can look down some of the headlines. A high-profile cancer researcher at the Ohio State University with 14 retractions. So that's 14 papers about discoveries in cancer research that turned out to be unreliable and had to be withdrawn. The author who has published more than 500 letters to the editor in a year. This is a problem of hyper-prolific authors who seem to get an incredible number of papers published. And it's really about chasing publication counts for career advancement. When you're publishing a paper every 5 days, as it says here, the scientific quality is rock bottom. But there are various ways people can keep up this output, like adding their names to each other's papers without actually contributing and stuff like that. Sage retracting 36 articles for compromised peer review. So peer review is supposed to be the gold standard, but it can totally be hacked by people helping each other out and all kinds of scams. One scam that Retraction Watch talks about is the special issue scam. A researcher writes to journals suggesting the idea of a special issue devoted to some topic that they are supposedly an expert in. If a journal takes the bait, the researcher gets to be a guest editor for that issue, and they can then publish the papers of all their friends or even sell the right to have a paper published. Florida University fires criminology professor blemished by retractions. So that seems to be another raft of papers that turned out to be invalid. Journal editors resign, strike in dispute with Wiley over business model that maximizes profit. Well, this is another whole area that concerns Retraction Watch and science generally, the problem of academic journals. Journals don't pay the academics who act as editors and peer reviewers. People do it for the kudos. Even less do the journals pay the people who write the papers, because academics are desperate to get their papers published and are so grateful when they are accepted you don't need to pay them. In fact, journals are now charging academics to publish their papers. This is something called open access, where the journal makes the article freely available and the academic pays for them to do that. And we're talking possibly thousands of pounds. It gives journals the incentive to publish any kind of rubbish just because they're being paid to do so. So journals don't pay for their content, and they can even get contributors to pay them. and they also enjoy slave labour from editors and reviewers. Nevertheless, they can charge huge amounts, tens of thousands of pounds, to university libraries that take the journals for their students. Now, how is all this possible? How do journals get away with it? Well, it's because it's government money, taxpayers' money, your money and mine. Nobody's spending their own money. The academics can provide slave labour because they're getting salaries from the university. They can also pay to publish with open access journals because they just take it out of their grants. When they bid for research funding, they include a line for publishing, so it's something they expect and it's not really painful. And libraries have big budgets to spend on journals which they get from the university, which ultimately gets it from the government or student tuition fees. So yeah, academic publishing is one hell of a racket and very lucrative for the few companies that control the vast majority of journals. The Kazakh scientist Alexandra Elbakyan condemns it as morally wrong. She says that the research is paid for by the general public through government grants, and therefore the general public should have access to the results. It should not be possible for a few fat cat publishers to make money out of it and otherwise block access to scientific knowledge to those in lower income countries whose universities are too poor to pay. So she has set up a pirate website to make academic papers available for free. Well, Alexandra Elbakyan is subject to a ton of copyright lawsuits and probably criminal charges, and she lives in hiding. Now, the scientific publishing industry owes its origins largely to the tycoon Robert Maxwell in the decades after the Second World War. Maxwell is an amazing figure. If you want a biography of him, read this one. This is what it says. Maxwell was born to a poor Jewish family in Czechoslovakia, living in one room and not even having a pair of shoes. When the Second World War broke out, he was a young man and he managed to join the British Army and rise to be an officer, where he was known for his bravery and worked in intelligence. After the war, he settled in Britain and got into academic publishing, initially by making available to English-speaking scientists lots of research papers captured from the Germans. He was an ambitious businessman and he set about proliferating the number of journals he was publishing because he realized it was a license to print money. All he needed to do was come up with a title like International Journal of Basket Weaving, persuade some academic to become editor for his own personal vanity, and Maxwell was away. All the basket weaving departments around the country would be on to their university libraries saying, we've got to take this International Journal of Basket Weaving so that we can keep abreast of research in our field. And Maxwell could charge the libraries practically anything he liked to supply them with his journal. So he got very rich and very powerful with many connections around the world, which he put to good use by doing undercover work for Mossad. Things unravelled for him after he bought the Daily Mirror newspaper and started losing money. According to this, he approached the Israeli government for a bailout, saying, look, I've done a massive amount for Israel, now it's time for you to help me. And the Israeli government decided Maxwell knew too much and they couldn't let themselves be blackmailed by him. And in November 1991, he mysteriously fell overboard from his yacht and drowned. His yacht was called the Lady Ghislaine, named after his youngest daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, who is currently serving 20 years in a US prison for her role in the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. So anyway, the modern academic publishing industry owes its massive size and lucrative business model largely to the efforts of Robert Maxwell, who is typically described as a crook, and even the crook of the century. And here we see some academics protesting and resigning because of the way the publisher's profit motive distorts academic priorities and undermines the practice of good science. Another article: Journal asks scientists to step down from editorial board after sleuth's comments linked him to paper mill. A paper mill is a business that specialises in getting academics' names on published papers. One type of scam they go in for is that an academic might get a paper accepted in a journal, and then through the paper mill it's possible to sell the option to be included as a co-author. To be named as second author might be £20,000, to be third author would be £10,000, and so on. It's a purely financial transaction. You don't have to make any actual contribution to the paper or even have any expertise in the field involved. You just pay up. And why would scientists do this? Because getting papers published is important for your career, for keeping your job and getting promoted. Next headline: Economics study retracted after researchers find undocumented alterations in the code. So this seems to be a case of outright fraud. The undocumented alterations to the code made the model produce the desired predictions, and so on and so on. And that's just the last couple of weeks. And Retraction Watch has a page devoted to what it calls hijacked journals. It says hijacked journals mimic legitimate journals by adopting their titles, reference numbers, and so on, while having considerably less stringent publishing protocols. Scholars can be duped into publishing in hijacked journals, many of which require fees, by offers of fast publication and indexing in academic databases. Retraction Watch currently has a list of over 200 hijacked journals, and on top of this there are many journals that aren't hijacked but that are nevertheless dodgy and with low standards. I've published one or two papers and I regularly get emails from these outfits touting for business. Here is an example. I would like to speak with you regarding your recent work. I understand public outreach is a very important issue within the research community. I think this refers to the fact that government research grants these days usually require academics to show they are communicating their ideas to the general public. That's public outreach. So, like the typical unintended consequences of government rules, this has spawned an industry of dodgy publications purporting to provide such public outreach. It goes on: we are currently working on our October 2023 edition. We would like you to be one of those featured. My suggestion is that we might create a new article. This would be an entirely new article written and developed by Research Outreach in close collaboration with you. So it seems I wouldn't even have to do any work, though it will obviously cost me, as the email says. Some of the services we provide are paid for. Well, if your research budget includes a bit of money for public outreach, and these people come along offering to do it all painlessly for you, it might be a tempting offer. I don't know. I guess the fact that they exist suggests it must work to some extent. But I'm not an academic and have no interest in this, so delete. Retraction Watch also has a leaderboard of scientists with the most retractions to their name, and it says men continue to dominate. Nevertheless, a recent scandal concerns a prominent female professor at Harvard who specialised in studying dishonesty and has now been found to have faked her data. A personality who features a lot in Retraction Watch is Elizabeth Bick, a microbiologist, not as a fraudster but as someone who has made a specialisation of spotting fraud in scientific papers, particularly photos of biological experiments. She has shown that scientists reuse the same photos, claiming that they represent different things, sometimes cropping them or turning them upside down, presumably in the hope it will be less detectable. Now, I don't really understand why the scientists do this. If you're going to do fraud, why not take a different photo so it's not so obvious? Presumably, it's not as simple as that. Apparently, one reason is if you've forgotten to do a control experiment, then you have to make up a photo from the ones you have to hand. Anyway, BIC has found over 4,000 instances of photo manipulation and other kinds of fraud in academic papers. So there is a kind of marriage made in hell between money-driven publishers and career-driven academics, where scientific quality goes out the window, and you get all these shenanigans that mean the sacred knowledge of science that we are supposed to trust is corrupted with fakery and fraud. Now, you could say that the fact retractions occur shows that science is self-correcting and everything is okay. Or you could say that it is the tip of the iceberg and the corruption is hardwired into the system. The thing is that science has become an industry or a kind of machine with all its journals and university departments and with all the jobs that hang off that. And it's only natural that you're going to get people gaming the system. We're a long way from the times of Newton and Du Châtelet, when researchers freely exchanged their thoughts and discoveries just for the love of finding out about nature. We're as far from those times as the church, with all its bank accounts and bureaucracy, is from the days of Jesus and his 12 apostles. So we can start to understand why, as a famous paper by the Stanford University professor John Ioannidis put it in 2006, most published research findings are false. This is not about fraud, it's about the way a lot of scientific discoveries depend on statistical significance. If you're investigating something like, does this drug work for this form of cancer, you compare a group of people given the drug with a group of people not given the drug. If the group given the drug does better, you say the drug works. Except that you have to consider the possibility the group with the drug just got better by chance. And there are statistical calculations you can do to tell you what the likelihood is of it occurring by chance. And the typical assumption is that if there's less than a 1 in 20 chance of it happening randomly, then you can take it that it was the drug. But the problem with that is that if 20 different research teams publish papers saying we found this or that effect, then on average 1 out of the 20 will be a false positive. It will just be a result of random chance. But it's worse than that, because what a research team can do is, say, test 20 drugs, and then one of them will come out as seeming to work just by chance. And what they'll do is brush aside the 19 that didn't work and say, this one is good, and publish their paper about that. And if all research teams were doing that, then they might all be coming up with findings that are just the result of chance. And it would mean that every single research paper could be false. That is the extreme. But Ioannidis showed that if you make some reasonable assumptions about how science is currently practiced, then it looks as though not all but most research findings are false. Nevertheless, publishers want publishable results so they can sell their journals and make money, and researchers want publishable results so they can get promotion points and a better salary, and drug companies want drugs backed up by publishable results so that they can start marketing them to doctors and make lots of profits. So everyone involved here has an incentive to look the other way and pretend everything is fine, which is not conducive to getting this problem fixed. The novelist Upton Sinclair said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." Now, if the results of a scientific study are due to chance and someone went back and did the research again, the next time it probably wouldn't work and you'd realise it was due to chance. But the problem is that no one wants to go back and check things which may end up just confirming something that's already known. Journals want exciting new results. Funding committees want original investigation. Researchers want to break new ground. So no one is going to be interested in checking over old results. But that said, some people have taken the trouble to go back over old results, perhaps inspired by Ioannidis's paper, and so we have the replication crisis, where it is found that indeed most published results can't be replicated by follow-up research. This started in psychology, where it was found that barely a third of published results checked out when researchers did the experiment again. And the replication crisis is spreading to other disciplines. Out of 53 key studies on the science of cancer, only 6 checked out when they were looked at again. So yes, far from providing objective knowledge that is more reliable than other religions, it looks as though the literalist institution of science TM as a body of dogma is providing us with what is often gibberish and false when it is not outright fakery. Now you could say that's not true science, and you'd be right. True science is Gnostic science and free inquiry, whereas I've just been talking about literalist institutional science, which has been taken over by the dogmatists and is massively distorted by human frailties. But this is nevertheless important. Literalist science presents itself as somehow different from other systems of thought and capable of providing us with true knowledge. And what we've seen is that, as David Rapp said, that claim involves a fair amount of bunk. The dogmatic faith-based orthodoxy of scientism, despite its claims of empiricism, is as decoupled from empirical reality as the dogmatic faith-based orthodoxies of every other form of religion. It's not different from religion, it is a religion. It's just that religion is a broad concept, and sociologists find it hard to define because religions can have very different approaches. Christianity, for example, involves the idea of a personal God, but Buddhism, or at least some forms of Buddhism, don't involve the idea of a deity at all. But these are both religions. In the same way, science can be a religion without outwardly looking like either Christianity or Buddhism and fetishizing other ideas and practices instead. But what about those fundamental ideas that emerge from Gnostic science? Do they not express fundamental truths obtained through observation and confirmed by experiment? Well, remember what Spengler said about evolutionary theory, that everything in Darwin is already in Schopenhauer. Darwinism is just a culturally biased Western way of looking at natural history. It's not true in any sense, and that is why there are all these issues with it that I have discussed. Now, in his book Physics as Metaphor, Roger Jones points out how we don't directly experience the world as it really is, even though that is what we feel we're doing. Our brain is sitting there in its bony case and getting all sorts of signals from our senses in the form of electrical impulses, which it then builds into a coherent picture. And he says that concepts like distance and time are best regarded as metaphors that our brains use to separate out events and make sense of them. As Einstein showed, distance and time are not absolute, but can shrink and grow depending on the observer. They don't describe ultimate reality, but are interpretations of reality produced by our brains. Now, Spengler says that it is a cultural characteristic of Western civilization to think of things in terms of great distances, contrasted with, say, classical civilization that thought of things as compact and close up. He says this is why the theory of perspective was developed in the West and not, say, by the Chinese. It's because Western culture has a bias to think of space in terms of great or infinite distances. It's for the same reason, he says, that Western religious buildings, the cathedrals, tend to enclose vast empty spaces, while classical civilization, with its close-up view of the universe, built compact solid temples. And again, classical civilization, with its bias for compactness, thought of the stars and planets as existing on tight-packed crystal spheres closely enclosing the Earth, whereas Western civilization, with its bias for great and infinite distance, thinks of them as at great distances. The Western view is not more correct, it just reflects a different worldview. The reason we consider the universe to be vast and full of empty space is the same as the reason we make our religious buildings vast and full of empty space. It's a cultural bias. Now you may say, but hang on, we know the distances to the stars and galaxies. We have objective ways of measuring it. For example, we can tell the distances of the nearest stars through parallax. As the Earth moves around the Sun, we see the star first over there and then over there. And we can use the angle of the variation to work out how far away the star must be. And it's a very long way. And similarly, we know how bright the average galaxy is. The fainter a galaxy is, the further away it must be. And again, we can work that out. And it can be from millions to billions of light years. So we're not making this up. It's not just a cultural thing. Stars and galaxies really are a long way away. Well, yes, but remember Jones's point that distance is a metaphor. The parallax and the brightness variations are real. Distance is our brain's way of making sense of this data. And there are various things that suggest our thinking about distances in the universe may not reflect what's really going on. One example is quantum entanglement. It means that two particles can be on opposite sides of the galaxy, but still connected in some mysterious way, so that what happens to one of them immediately affects the other one. And this has been a controversial idea. People have said that can't happen. Things can't be a million light years apart and yet still connected. And without delving into the details, it turns out that yes, that is the only possible interpretation. This comes from something called Bell's theorem, and people have won Nobel Prizes for demonstrating it beyond a doubt. It's known as non-locality, meaning that position or distance doesn't matter in whether things are connected. So it's accepted, but it still doesn't seem to make sense how information can be transmitted from one particle to another across millions of light years just as instantly as if they were right next to each other. And I'd say it doesn't make sense, not because quantum physics is weird, but because we don't really understand distance. One day it will make sense, and we will then understand that our whole concept of vast distances was just a metaphor, and we will have a deeper picture of reality, maybe one that will allow us to create warp drives and cross those vast distances ourselves in a blink of an eye. Other examples of seemingly big holes in our present understanding of physics are the fact that the outer parts of galaxies seem to be rotating faster than they ought to be, and the fact that the universe is not only expanding, but the expansion is speeding up when gravitational attraction ought to be slowing it down. To try and explain these things, people have invented dark matter and dark energy, but those are big mysteries that raise as many questions as answers. They seem to be signs that our whole way of looking at the universe is wrong at some fundamental level. The Romans had a naive view of physics, and we have a view of physics that may be a bit better, but is still naive and based on everyday concepts like distance that don't work for the aspects of the universe we're trying to understand. And that is why Richard Feynman, the very famous physicist, said, "I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. We can't understand it with our current concepts." So yeah, it's not just academic fakery and fraud and literalist reliance on flawed dogma rather than open-minded investigation, even at a fundamental level, our picture of the universe is naive and incomplete, and the various anomalies and puzzles in modern science show that to be the case. So, yes, our scientific understanding of the universe is not true. It is just our current belief system. It is just our current way of looking at it, like any other religion. Now, I go a long way with Spengler, but I don't agree with his claim, if this is what he meant, that the world views of different civilizations are themselves just different rather than better or worse. I think there has been intellectual progress, and our understanding of the universe is getting us closer to the essence of things, because apart from anything else, it is getting to be more useful. It's just that we can't say science is different from religion because this body of belief we call science is the truth, whereas that body of belief we call religion is deluded. No, scientific beliefs are not the final truth. They are another type of religious belief. When you make a distinction between science and religion, what you are really talking about is the distinction between gnosis and literalism, and that exists in every religion. So it's not science versus religion, it's gnosis versus literalism. And with scientism, there is a sleight of hand here. The scientific literalists like Dawkins, with their "if you don't believe, you are insane," dress themselves up in the clothes of free-thinking Gnostics, while actually being dogmatic literalists. Someone like Dawkins borrows the credentials of the Gnostic Galileo, say, when Dawkins actually has more in common with the literalist cardinals who opposed Galileo. He is not an investigator or an inquirer. He associates himself with and proselytizes for the orthodoxy of the day, which was once the New Testament gospel and is today the gospel of Darwin. Different content, same style. And I think we see this psychological liaison between scientific and Christian literalism in the way that the church has taken up the whole climate change dogma. We know that climate change is a literalist conception because of the way it refers to the science, i.e. the sacred knowledge, and speaks of the scientific consensus, i.e. the dogma. Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park, famously said, "Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It is a way to avoid debate by claiming the matter is already settled. Let's be clear, the work of science has nothing whatever to do with consensus. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus." And he went on to give examples where a scientific consensus blocked what were eventually found to be correct ideas, such as to do with the causes of disease. Michael Crichton was very critical of global warming dogma and published a novel about the corruption of climate science. This was condemned because it could mislead people, exactly like the church, which has a list of prohibited books that could mislead the faithful. And we have defenders of the literalist dogma explaining why Michael Crichton was wrong and consensus is an important part of science. What they mean is that consensus is an important part of scientism, science as secure knowledge, whereas Crichton meant that it is not a part of real science, free inquiry into how nature works. Now, I don't really want to get into detailed critiques of global warming dogmatists, as I don't think it's worth it, but I have to observe that the gaslighting in this article is extreme. It has a subtitle, "It's used by both sides in the climate debates, but consensus is part of a process." Crichton explicitly condemned consensus, and yet the article tries to persuade us that climate critics appeal to consensus as much as climate believers. That is utter nonsense, and if it were true, why would this article spend so much time trying to persuade us that consensus is good if, supposedly, both sides of the argument already believe in consensus, and it's only a question of which consensus is right. Gaslighting. Anyway, as a popular novelist using his books to combat climate dogma, Michael Crichton might have been able to get ordinary people to question it, as the Nature book reviewer feared, but he died prematurely a few years later. Back to the point. Global warming is part of literalist Science TM, and its take-up by the Church, another literalist institution, suggests how literalists have much in common, even when they come from different belief systems. Climate activism involves the same moralizing and thought control that are part of the Church's own modus operandi. Now, the triumph of literalism over Gnosticism in the Christian Church was very much associated with and supported by the Roman state. After the Emperor Constantine the Great became Christian, he held the Council of Nicaea, which Wikipedia tells us was the first effort to attain consensus in the Church. This council led to the Nicene Creed, a declaration of what Christians should believe. Creed comes from credo, Latin for I believe. So here we see literalism getting into gear, Christianity turning into a rigid belief system and beginning the process of stamping out Gnostic free thinking, otherwise known as heresy. And what we also see is the beginning of a mutual dependence between the imperial government and the emerging church bureaucracy. The emperor provided the church with protection and funding. Over the coming centuries, many churches and monasteries would be built with the money of rulers and nobility. And in return, the church provided the emperor with legitimacy, encouraging ordinary Christians to support him as their champion, the defender of Christian belief. In science, we can see this same relationship of mutual support between the state and literalist doctrinaires. A large part of the work of science is done with public money, and this not only influences what science is done, but motivates scientific researchers, if they want to keep getting grants, to come up with results that resonate with government agendas. In their book Complexity Theory and the Social Sciences, David Byrne and Jill Callaghan note how in Britain the effect of the government promising to base its policies on scientific input is that it gets back what researchers think the government wants to hear. They say we find not so much research-based policy as policy-based research. In Economic Laws of Scientific Research, Terence Keeley argues that government-funded science, which is supposed to be an engine of economic growth, is less productive and less innovative than research funded by private interests. Private research is sensitive to commercial pressures and is likely to be more realistic, less constrained by dogma, and more committed to following through to practical results. And while the state can fund open-ended Gnostic science, as with Scheuer's M-Drive, the literalist institutional kind of science that is focused on universities gets a lot of its money from the state, and in return the state gets legitimation of its political agendas. We see this with the climate movement, where scientists have identified the supposed threat of climate change, and this gives legitimacy to governments' plans for new taxes, prohibition of certain kinds of economic activity, and other forms of social control, such as in future possibly whether we can fly abroad or what we may eat, and even whether we can move around the cities in which we live. If the government spontaneously imposed these taxes and controls, there might be resistance. Pointing to the scientific consensus, though, gives the government the high ground. We might disagree with politicians, but who could disagree with science? That is, science TM. We also saw this with the pandemic. Again, science legitimised the tough controls that were introduced. scientific modelling, for example, proved the need for prolonged, stringent lockdowns, and those who questioned their logic or correspondence to reality were marginalised as outside the scientific consensus. The modellers and politicians were later found to have broken the very rules supposedly mandated by the science, suggesting that they didn't believe their own analysis and that science indeed served them as a source of political legitimacy, not as a genuine assessment of medical risk. Retraction Watch has kept a special list of retracted COVID-19 studies, which now has over 300 entries. Now, both the pandemic and climate change represent global problems, and therefore they help justify the empowerment of unelected global bureaucracies like the United Nations and World Health Organization. The legitimizing function of literalist science may therefore be being especially cultivated for its usefulness in justifying moves towards a global government. Now, while some might say I'm veering into the realms of conspiracy theory, the theoretical historian Jonathan Friedman has written about the emergence of globalized bureaucrats who enjoy enormous tax-free salaries and are not owners of production like capitalist elites, but are what might be called pork barrel elites, i.e. parasitic on public finances. He says this kind of global elite distances itself from the people, who represent the national, the unsophisticated, the racist, and expresses loyalty to humanity rather than to its fellow citizens, or if to its own citizens, to immigrants above nationals. And he observes that this globalism or cosmopolitanism has numerous historical parallels, especially during times of hegemonic decline like that the United States is currently going through. This is his article, Concretizing the Continuity Argument in World System History, the Social Science of Long-Term Change. He's also talked about it in the books Hegemonic Decline, Present and Past, and PC Worlds, Political Correctness and Rising Elites at the End of Hegemony. The point is that the rise of a globalist elite appears to be a predictable aspect of the current world system trajectory, and this elite has a need for legitimation, i.e. to justify its existence. Science, meaning the literalist consensus science of the universities and international journals, itself parasitic on public money, appears to be a key source of such legitimation through its ability to identify global problems that need global elites to solve them. So science is a religion in the full technical sense of the word. Now, while religions can take on many different forms so that it's difficult to give a watertight definition, we can nevertheless recognize religions by their functions in society. And there are particularly three functions that I will separate out, though they kind of overlap. First, religions provide a cosmology, meaning an explanation of the universe and its origin and characteristics, and the place that humanity has in it. Second, they provide a system of ethics, separating right from wrong and specifying what good people ought to believe and how they should behave. And third, they provide legitimation of the social order, presenting political elites as favoured by the gods, protective of righteous people, and responsible for furthering the divine plan on earth. And today it is science that increasingly performs these social functions. So science is a cosmology. It purports to explain the origin of the cosmos, beginning with the Big Bang. And it purports to explain humans' position in nature as a product of natural selection, the survival of the fittest, leading to humans as the fittest and most capable of all creatures. Its ideas are not true any more than those of other religions are true, even though they claim to be. They're just our current way of looking at things, infused with cultural bias and transformed into dogma. Nevertheless, I would like to think that they are somewhat closer to the truth than the ideas of previous religions, and that they take us a few steps closer to the perfect enlightenment and understanding of the universe that humans will one day have, long after the modern scientific world picture has been and gone and other systems of thought have grown up in its place. Second, science is a system of ethics. From its original Gnostic phase of real science, there has emerged Scientism as a body of sacred knowledge, things like the law of conservation of momentum, which cannot be challenged any more than the Ten Commandments can be challenged, even though our ideas about momentum might be incomplete and only seem to make sense because of our partial understanding. In this respect, science emerges as a form of thought control, and so a potential tool for social control and ideological control. Science tells you what you need to believe, and from there it is a short step to tell you how to behave. And what religions typically do is hold up some principle of cosmic justice, threatening you with retribution unless you act in accordance with its precepts. This might be divine judgment at the second coming of Christ, or the law of karma, which means that your good or bad deeds will be repaid to you in kind. With scientism, this role is played especially by the climate change movement, which links human sins of greed and selfishness, i.e. burning through the earth's resources for a more comfortable lifestyle, to a forthcoming, albeit regularly postponed, catastrophic collapse of society and the biosphere, the scientistic apocalypse. This threatened apocalypse and people's attitudes to it, whether they believe in it and rein back their lifestyles or disbelieve and carry on living large off the earth's bounty, separates the righteous from the sinful. Eating meat and jetting off on holiday are wrong and wicked, and this is supposedly proven by science. So yes, institutional science is a system of ethics. Consider the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia, which has played a big role in establishing the climate change narrative. And it offers an MSc on climate change. It says many lecturers on the course are part of the Climatic Research Unit, and they will provide evidence to inform society's transition to a sustainable, low-carbon and climate-resilient future. To which I might say, I don't want the future to be sustainable. Why can't we expand off Earth into the solar system and later the galaxy, building an ever stronger and more capable civilization, controlling ever more space, energy and resources, having an ever larger human population and creating an ever larger human footprint on the cosmos? Well, sorry, but that's not what's coming. The world's political elite, especially the globalist bureaucracy that does not have to answer to voters, is committed to the goal of sustainability. The United Nations has sustainable development goals. So the globalist elite's vision of the human future is very different from mine. And this vision of the globalist elite is supported by scientism, which is churning out masters of science dedicated to attaining a sustainable low-carbon future. And it's not just climate science that has this ethical character. In the field of race and gender, for example, science confirms contemporary ethical judgments, so that when James Watson, who discovered the structure of DNA, expressed views on genetics that were found to be unethical by those standards, he was deprived of his scientific honours. So yes, science here is not just a belief system, but a source of validation for ethical and moral judgments about how humans should think and behave. And third, science provides legitimation of the political order. This is a classic function of religion. In the earliest civilizations, gods and rulers had a close relationship, from religious ceremonies to the role of temples in tax collection. King Charles was crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, And he rules, as it says on our coins, DG, Dei Gratia, by the grace of God. And science has come to fill this role. The globalist organisations ally themselves with science as they attempt to direct the policies of world governments, for example, in this UN-sponsored report. And science is again appealed to by those governments as they sell the measures to their populations. The grassroots activists who have absorbed this message similarly appeal to science as their motivation when they campaign for new forms of public morality and social change, often linking it to their political opinion. In the 1960s and early 1970s, activists actually mistrusted science. In 1972, a conference called Civilization and Science in Conflict or Collaboration addressed what it called the anti-science movement. This was the view of environmental activists at that time, that science was anti-human and responsible for the exploitation of Mother Nature. Since then, there has been a 180-degree turnaround. Science has become the friend, not the enemy of the environment, and so it has achieved ideological capture of the kind of people who might normally resist the political order, turning them into allies and supporters of the programs being pushed through by the elites. The activists' only complaint is that the political controls being imposed on society are not coming soon enough. Just like Christianity, science has gone from an intellectual rebellion to a means of acclimatising the masses to their own subordination. So if we look back through history and around the world, we see that religion is a ubiquitous feature of human sociality. The three functions I have mentioned need to be performed by something. Societies need an understanding of their place in the universe. People need a moral metric by which they can assess themselves as just and feel aligned with their peers. And elites need to be able to justify their privileges by presenting themselves as performing important duties, saving the world from chaos. Look at this 1972 comic strip by the French cartoonist Sampé. A businessman is in his office. Sales are rising. The business is going great. And yet he looks fed up. And then, oh dear, sales take a dip. And he's on the phone. He calls a tense meeting. He walks through the office this way and that way. He catches a plane for another meeting. He works through the night. He catches a train. Another meeting. Another flight. More dossiers and urgent phone calls. And at last, sales stop falling. He smiles. Now sales go up. He smiles more and leans back in his chair. And sales keep rising, and now he looks glum again. What is the message of this cartoon? It is that it is overcoming difficulties that gives life meaning. During the time when he is rushing around to deal with the problem of falling sales, the businessman feels alive. He has a purpose. His life has meaning. Without a problem, he has no purpose. And without a purpose, his life has no meaning. Today, in the rich countries, when people live more comfortably and safely than the human race has ever known, there is a desperate need for meaning, for purpose, and for difficulties to overcome. And here is the American statesman John Kerry flying in by his private jet to another climate summit, briefcase in hand like the businessman in Sampé's cartoon, on his mission to save the world. He feels important. He feels he has purpose. And the people in the street also find meaning as they struggle to avert the apocalypse. And science, or scientism, is the religious framework within which this meaning is constructed. Science establishes the existence of the problem, tells people what they need to do, and legitimizes the actions of the elites who have appointed themselves to deal with it. And this scientistic religion seems to be championed particularly by the supranational, unaccountable global elite, the same way Christianity was co-opted by the Roman state. And I'm rather afraid that science is emerging as the ideological toolkit of the stagnant, micromanaged, technocratic world order that I have described as the coming Brown Age. Scientism is the mechanism of mass mind control that will stabilise unfree societies and justify the restrictions they impose on human behaviour. And in this respect, those of us who see this are really only just catching up with people like C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley and other dystopian novelists who could already see in the mid-20th century that this is the direction in which the world is heading.